In Acts 9, Paul thought he was headed in the right direction, following God, but God intervened and turned his life around. You remember that soon after the birth of Christianity, the followers of Jesus, who were all Jews in those days, began to be persecuted by their Jewish countrymen, particularly those who were zealous for God's word and God's law. An early leader in the hunt for those who believed in Jesus was Paul, whose Hebrew name was Saul, who set out to find them in neighboring cities and return them to the rulers in Jerusalem for judgment. While on his way to Damascus to arrest more Jewish believers, Paul was suddenly knocked to ground by a light from heaven. A voice accompanying the light asked, "Why are you persecuting me?" Of course, Paul was dumbfounded as to who would ask such a question where he was busy about God's business. He was likely more amazed to learn that it was Jesus himself speaking to him from heaven. The one whom he had believed to be a fraud was alive in glory. Perhaps most amazing is that he commissioned Paul, the one responsible for the murder of many of his followers, to take the news of Jews to those who had not heard. This event was a total turn up in Paul's life. No longer did he persecute Christ's followers, he was now persecuted for his own belief in the resurrected Jesus. No longer was the poster child for the Jewish rulers and Pharisees, he was now their enemy. No longer was he focused on extinguishing the gospel, he was now its chief distributor. Paul was on one side one minute and on the other the next, and in that moment everything changed. His complete turnaround is one of the most compelling reasons to believe that Jesus was truly resurrected from the dead. How else can you explain such a U-turn? Each of us must also make a U-turn in life, just as Paul did, because we are also headed in the wrong direction. The direction we are headed seems right for a while. We do good things along the way. We may even think we are going God's way, headed towards Him. However, the time comes when we realize that it's not God's way at all, but we are headed the wrong way. We are not in God's race at all, but on a different course. God is calling us to make a U-turn to follow Jesus. If we had been part of a culture of that day, we would have said that Paul had an outstanding resume as a Jew. He had every advantage. He had been to all the right schools. He was a man going places in Jewish religious community. As great as these things were, Paul says, they were actually liabilities to him when it came to Jesus, whose goodness far surpasses any resume that he could produce. Before he made a U-turn, he thought his resume looked pretty good, but God showed him otherwise. Paul's resume was actually deficient. We are going the wrong way, just as Paul was, thinking we had great resumes to show God when they are in reality lacking. We each must make a U-turn because we are trusting in our deficient resumes for God's acceptance. Perhaps we think that we are born into a relationship with God because of our parents or because of our religious heritage, or we might feel that we have achieved enough in life for God to accept us. It's possible we look around and see that we have lived more godly lives than others have. So on a sliding scale, we are accepted and loved by God. But Paul says the opposite is true. The only way that we can compare ourselves to is God Himself, and we fall short of His perfection. Paul's resume suggested that he was a righteous man, that he was doing the things that were right in God's eyes. Do you think God would be impressed with your resume? Would He say that you have been choosing what He says is right all the time? We are headed the wrong way because we think we are righteous and that our resume should make God accept us. That belief that we are good enough for God is pride, which is at the root of our other sins. When we turn from God's way to our own, it's pride that trusts in our own wisdom. When we refuse to bow the knee to the Creator of the universe, it's pride that rejects His rule in our lives. When we look at our own accomplishments and compare them to others who have done less, it's pride that judges others on what we can see. We go the wrong direction, trusting in our deficient resumes for God's acceptance, thinking we are righteous because we fail to compare our resumes to God's word. Instead of comparing ourselves to what God says about us, we compare ourselves to others who don't seem to be doing as well as we are. They aren't as good, as generous, as sacrificial, or as holy as we are. What are our resumes like before God?